World Crisis Radio. So the question is, if you look at Tunisia, what would Leibniz do? Leibniz would propose the bridge tunnel from Tunisia to Sicily. You complete that rail link, the bridge and road across the Straits of Messina, linking Sicily to Calabria. At that point, you could go from Tunis to Rome in a few hours using superfast maglev rail. And that would mean that the entire commerce between Europe and Africa as a whole, including North Africa and significant parts of the Arab world like Algeria and Libya and Morocco and Egypt, and would reach into places like Somalia, Sudan, all of that would go through Tunisia. Tunisia at that point would become the hub of that entire region. The alternatives, of course, are to do the same thing through the Straits of Gibraltar, but if you're from Tunisia, you want to make sure that there's a direct rail and road link on a bridge tunnel combination between the northern coast of Tunisia, the southwest coast of Sicily. Again, you can see across. I've done it myself. There's the answer to that one, and put up some money. Doesn't matter where you get it. 0% credit. The U.S. should be involved in doing that, partly as a way to sell some exports, partly as a way to make money, and partly as a way to prevent these crises from continuously going on. Now, in the case of Russia, we have Michael McFaul. Michael McFaul is a guy who essentially became notorious for approving every crime that was done in Russia in the 1990s, as long as it was done by Yeltsin. He slavishly followed the U.S. line. Since the Clinton administration was backing Yeltsin, then Yeltsin could do whatever he wanted, and it was democratic. And McFaul, now seated in the National Security Council, would say, well, whatever it is, right? If it's IMF shock therapy and the destruction of the middle class, great, that's democratic. If it's nomenclatura privatizations where the communist officials take over the factories and become capitalist oligarchs overnight, and the workers and the common people get shafted, great, that's democratic. If it's the creation of these oligarchs using the state property of the Soviet Union and all the sacrifices that the people had made, great, says McFaul, that's also democratic. Then we get into the aughties, the 00 decade. McFaul is then looking at Ukraine. He sees the kleptocrats, IMF, NATO agents, Yushchenko, Timoshenko coming in Ukraine. Great, that's democratic too. He even wrote a book about that called Revolution in Orange, where he celebrates the singing tomorrows for Ukraine, except they never came. Same thing for roses, same thing for all these other places. So he is a lightweight, and he may be manic enough to think that he can get anywhere. Now, the meeting that he had, according to these cables, again, if they're true, was with a group of the human rights types in Moscow. This is the Helsinki Monitoring Group, couple of others. These people are not well known. A little bit better known are some of the other figures. In the course of these documents, we learned that there are three groups in the Russian opposition. There's the traditional one with Grigory Yavlinsky. This is the Yabluka party. This is a fairly institutionalized form. It's registered. It's accepted by the Kremlin to that extent. And Yavlinsky is to some degree a serious person. He was, after all, the author of the Yavlinsky-Shatalin 500-day plan about 1990 for a transition out of the communist system. It wasn't the worst. It wasn't really what you'd need. But anyway, Yavlinsky might be taken seriously. But his problem is that he demands to be the head of whatever regroupment emerges. And, of course, he's the only one with a political party that gets votes. Then you have a middle group around Ryzhkov. Ryzhkov was a prime minister in the late Gorbachev period when Yavlinsky, interestingly enough, attacked him as being incompetent. So the idea here is that they're willing to work within the system. This is a Gorbachev-era has-been. But he would just like to get registered. He'd like to do what Yavlinsky is doing. And then you have the extremists. We have Kasyanov, who was a prime minister under Putin in the early aughties. He's now thoroughly disgruntled. And then we get the even more extreme guys. Gerashenko, former head of the central bank. This is sort of the ethnic chauvinist Rodina, motherland, movement, extreme right-winger, was the central bank chief. Interesting combination. And then we have Kasyanov, we have Gerashenko, we have Garry Kasparov, the former chess champion, who has now become a foaming, raving opponent of the Putin regime. And then we get to his friends, and this is where it gets really ugly. Eduard Limonov, the national Bolshevik, a national Bolshevik being more or less neo-fascist. These are the skinheads. These are the ethnic plug uglies that you have over there. And, of course, when we say Kasparov and Limonov, then Boris Nemtsov is another guy in that troika of the extreme anti-Putin people. Now, Nemtsov was the deputy prime minister in the late Yeltsin period, in the late 90s. He, of course, was a great, young wolf, as he was called at the time. He was one of the young wolves or young reformers. More shock therapy, more demolition of standards of living, right? More destruction of unions, more free market, of course. That's what these guys were dealing with. Look at the results. When the Soviet, the Russian government went bankrupt in 1998, that more or less knocked Nemtsov out of the picture. He couldn't be a candidate. He was too hated because everybody had put their money in the bank, and then the banks blew and the treasury market blew. There's a good example. When the Russian GKO market blew in September of 1998, that was absolute chaos and miseration for a few more years. And that's, of course, a small sample of what would happen if that ever came here. If you ever had the default of the U.S. Treasury market, you would have a worldwide panic like you've never seen, probably since September 21st, 1931, when the British defaulted on gold payment at that time. But you see now the people that McFaul wants to work with. On the one side, we have the prima donna Yavlinsky, who wants to be the head of everything. McFaul's candidate is Nemtsov. Now, Nemtsov came here to the United States November of last year, went to the Harriman Institute, Columbia University, and so forth. He's being groomed. The problem is he's an extreme right-winger. His group is called the Union of Right Forces, Soyuz Pravich Sil. So an extreme right-winger, how somebody like Yavlinsky, I think, still tries to be a moderate. Some of these human rights people still have some kind of leftist residue. How are they going to support Nemtsov, and how are you going to have a candidate who's got these skinheads in his camp? The basic principle of the United States policy is you can be a neo-Nazi, and you will be declared a democratic force by the State Department, provided that you're anti-Putin. So that's the moral bankruptcy and the idiocy of the entire U.S. position. So they want to go back to the market Bolshevism of Nemtsov and, Yeltsin at that time, despite the fact that people remember the crash of 1998. If you look at Nemtsov, he has visited upon the Russian people every disaster in the book of economics. And it's a useful example because he did it with free market. He did it with exactly the free market malarkey that we hear from the so-called Tea Party hacks from the basically Republican operatives and Republican groups, right? IMF shock therapy, nomenclatura privatization to, people who have money already, market Bolshevism, market fetishism, the creation of more oligarchs, the super rich, of course, here in the United States, the top 1% own 40% of the assets. And the result of it was then a period of hyperinflation in 92, 93, 94, 1,000%, that's hyperinflation. And then deflation, the crash of 1998. So the worst of all possible worlds, and an extreme right-winger. So that's who your government is paying and sponsoring here in the United States. And this McFaul is a spook masquerading as a scholar. He's a quackademic, and it would be good to see him go back to Stanford University and do his quackademic stuff in the private sector. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio.